going to vehemently disagree with. And I think one of the best example of that is Jason Brennan, who wrote in his book, The Ethics of Voting, that human beings are overly differential to authority, that they cower before uniform opinion, that they are swayed not so much by reason, but by a desire to belong, by emotional appeal, and by sex appeal. And another view that I will be opposing, one that was beautifully put by Voltaire's translator, because it doesn't read so well in French, whoever can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. And broadly, the three theses that I will be criticizing today are first, that people are easy to persuade, even en masse, so that it's possible to just persuade a lot of people pretty quickly through advertising, propaganda, proselytizing, and other such means. That if people are easy to persuade, it is because they are quite bad at judging whom they should trust and what they should believe, that they don't have the, the good cognitive mechanisms to allow them to do that. And that because people are bad at evaluating stuff, communicated information, and that as a result, they are easy to persuade, they can be made to accept beliefs that lead to really disastrous consequences for themselves. So these are the theses that I think we can just, at the end of the talk, hopefully you'll agree can be safely rejected. So I'll start with the first one. So the being that people are easy to persuade even en masse. And to convince you that it is really not the case, I will look at three examples, three very prominent examples. The first one is propaganda in an authoritarian regime. And I will look at the Nazi regime in particular, but other examples could have been taken. The second is political campaigns in the US, and the third, advertising. So Nazi propaganda is obviously extremely infamous for its supposed effects and for its sheer power and size, and it was really dominated completely the airwaves for 12 years in Germany, and it has been rightfully the topic of a lot of scholarly attention, but most of that attention has focused on the content of the propaganda. So what articles were published in the newspapers, how were the movies made, and this sort of things. And it's only relatively late in a way that there was a first paper published on whether the propaganda worked. And so that was a paper by the noted historian Jan Kershaw, who looked at a wide variety of sources, including diaries, different archival material. And in particular, he looked at public opinion reports. And these are really revealing because they are, if you want, the equivalent of Gallup polls, but in an authoritarian regime in which you can't just ask people what they think or what they feel. And so it was a branch of the Nazi Party that was tasked with trying to figure out what the public was thinking, essentially in order to avoid an open rebellion. And these people were, Nazis reporting to other Nazis. And on the basis of these type of documents, Kershaw's conclusion was that Nazi propaganda largely failed, except when it could build on existing consensus, confirm existing values, and bolster existing prejudices. So essentially, when the Germans already felt, or when at least some Germans already felt in a given manner, the propaganda could be at least effective in the sense of spreading its messages. But whenever that was not the case, the propaganda was soundly rejected. And since Kershaw's work of over nearly 40 years ago now, there has been more quantitative studies that have confirmed his predictions, or his observations rather. And a very lovely one was conducted by Maya Dena and her colleagues. And the way they did that is they used the position of radio towers as an exogenous variable. And so they measured how far away people in Germany at the time were to radio towers. And they used that as a proxy for exposure to German propaganda, to Nazi propaganda, given that really radio was the main mean of propaganda at the time. And given that the Nazis had not decided where to put the radio towers, it essentially gives you an exogenous way of controlling for exposure to propaganda. And then they looked at whether people who were closer to the radio towers and who therefore were exposed to more propaganda were more or less likely to engage in anti-Semitic actions, such as denouncing Jews to the authorities. And so what they found was that indeed, sometimes Nazi propaganda seemed to boost anti-Semitic acts, but that was only true in areas that were already highly anti-Semitic, and that on the contrary, it tended to backfire in other areas. So it shows that the public is quite discerning in a way, and that it's only people who are already highly anti-Semitic who presumably heard the propaganda and took it as a signal that the government was kind of backing up their anti-Semitism and was allowing them to act on their anti-Semitism. And indeed, they have this really kind of amazing data point, or kind of regression table, in which they show that if you want to know where there's going to be more anti-Semitic acts in Germany, during the Nazi regime, you're much better off not looking at how much propaganda people were exposed to, but looking at where there had been pogroms in the 14th century. So there's this kind of amazing and extremely dramatic continuity in anti-Semitism, but really propaganda is just like a kind of a mere ripple on that kind of long trend. And really the cherry on the cake is this really kind of nice quote that has been unearthed by Kershaw within the reports of that Nazi intelligence agency I was describing earlier, who said that our propaganda encounters rejection everywhere among the population because it is regarded as wrong and lying. And so that was partially true after Stalingrad, and the Germans were turning en masse to the BBC because they knew it was more reliable than the German radio, even though doing so could lead to the death penalty. The second example I will take is that of political campaigns in the US. So I'm looking at the data in the US because that's where there is by far the most data, and also because a lot of money is spent on political campaigns in the US. And so, it takes many different forms. It can be, as you can see here, TV ads or online ads or canvassing, robocalling, distributing flyers, and many such things. And over the past about 20 years now, political scientists have tried to figure out whether each of these individual campaign acts, so not the campaign as a whole, which is really hard to measure, but each of these actions, one round of canvassing, sending one batch of flyers, having some more TV ads, whether each of these acts has an effect. And so to measure that, they conducted randomized controlled trials. So you take, for instance, a city or a state, and it is divided already in electoral districts. And in half of the districts at random, you are going to engage in an extra round of canvassing or robocalling or distributing flyers or whatever. And in the other half, you don't. Or you can divide the state is divided in different TV markets, and you play different ads or more ads in some of these TV markets than in the others. And then you look at whether this experiment, essentially this manipulation, has an effect on voting behavior. So the best evidence we have on this comes from a review and kind of meta-analysis by Josh Callan and Dave Brookman, published a few years ago, in which they looked at 40 existing experiments and added 9 experiments of their own. And their conclusion was that the best estimate of the effects of campaign contact and advertising on Americans' candidates' choices in general elections, so essentially, whether each of these, of these campaign acts has an effect on big ticket items like, congressional or presidential elections, the average effect estimated was 0. So, maybe very small in some cases, but on average, the effect was just so tiny that it could not be detected. And that's quite broadly the political science literature suggests, that there are no effects of political campaigns in major elections shortly before election day. When you have effects early on in the campaign, they tend to have washed out by election day. The effects are larger, albeit typically still quite weak for elections that have weak priors. So like if you take ballot measures or primaries, people cannot rely on their basic heuristic of picking the right-wing candidate or the left-wing candidate. And so they are easier to influence, but the effects remain quite small. We know that's really well established that politicians can have a large impact on the opinions of their followers, But the data suggests that this is only true for what political scientists call non-attitudes. So essentially, if you're a big Elizabeth Warren fan, and she takes on a position about some trade treaty that you've never heard about, you're quite likely to accept her position. But if she takes a position about something you're knowledgeable about and that's important to you, then if she doesn't agree with you, you'll just think less of her instead of changing your mind. And indeed, the data shows that most of the influence on politicians, so most of the influence really runs from the population to politicians who are, ever conscious of what the people think. They do focus groups, they do polling, they look at all that data to try to engage in, to develop policies and to do messaging that will appeal to their voters. And the last example I will take is that of advertising, which completely dwarfs the amount of money spent on political campaigns. So I think in 2020 or something, it was maybe 2019, it was like $500 billion were spent worldwide on advertising. So it's a big business. And surprisingly, or maybe actually unsurprisingly, given the results I'm about to show you, it's only quite recently that there has been some solid studies of the efficacy of advertising. And the way this is done typically is by attempting to measure the elasticity of advertising, which means that if you take an existing ad campaign and you increase how much advertising is done, so you increase how many TV ads you're going to play, you increase how many a magazine advertising you're going to do, etc. How much do the sales increase as a result? And so if you double, for instance, if you double your advertising budget and your sales double, your elasticity is 1. If you double your advertising budget, or how many ads you play, and the sales only increase by 50%, then your elasticity is 0.5. So when it comes to TV advertising, the best data we have is from a big paper that has looked at hundreds and hundreds of TV campaigns that was published actually last year. That was just a working paper by Brad Shapiro and his team. And what they show is that the results reveal a sizable percentage of statistically insignificant or negative estimates. So in a lot of the cases, the campaigns just appear to have no effect, or indeed to have even sometimes a negative effect. And on average, which is really the big number, on average, the elasticity was 0.01, which means that typically, if you double the advertising budget for something, your sales are going to increase by 1%. And as a comparison point, the elasticity for cost is really large. So people are really sensitive to differences in prices. But by comparison, advertising seems to have very, very close to no effect. So broadly, the literature on advertising shows that the effects are very small or non-existent. I mean, they do exist, and clearly some campaigns are worthwhile, but on the whole, the effects tend to be very small. And that's something that was known kind of less formally for a while. And for instance, already 20 years ago in his book, the kind of gurus of advertising research, Gerard Tellis, was writing that the truth, as many advertisers will quickly admit, is that persuasion is very tough. So what these examples show is that mass persuasion persuades nearly no one. And I could have gone through other examples of kind of proselytizing and other kind of religious or other examples, and it just doesn't work. The only messages that you will manage to spread through mass persuasion are those that resonate with people's priors. So, if you know that the population is already anti-Semitic and you want to spread false beliefs about Jewish people and false negative beliefs about Jewish people, then you'll be, it's going to be quite easy. But the beliefs are not going to have, the message is not going to have a large impact because, people already are anti-Semitic. And it's only really when some trust has been earned that some influence is possible at the margin. So the example I was giving earlier is that of politicians. So if over many years you've come to develop trust in a given politician who you think has represented well your point of view, then they can exert some influence on you. But even then, typically only for things that don't really matter to you. So why? Why is it so hard? the first thesis I just tried to debunk there, the idea that people could be persuaded en masse, it was then linked with the idea that people are really bad at evaluating information. And so by contrast, I'm going to make the argument that if mass persuasion tends to fail, it is because, on the contrary, people are actually quite good at evaluating communicated information. And in particular, if we are able to evaluate communicated information, it is because we possess sophisticated cognitive mechanisms of open vigilance, mechanisms that we had called earlier mechanisms of epistemic vigilance. It's really the same thing, just trying to stress the fact that these mechanisms not only allow you to reject bad messages, but maybe more importantly, they allow you to be open enough to accept positive, to accept reliable messages. So how does that work? Well, the way I think it works anyway is that when you're told or when you read something, the first thing that happens is that you will check the plausibility of the content given your priors. So for instance, if Joan tells you you should buy this phone, the first thing you will do is think, well, okay, do I know anything about this phone? So for instance, if you hate everything Apple and it's an iPhone, your first reaction would be to disbelieve Joan. And that's just the default reaction we have. Anything that people tell us that doesn't fit with our priors, we tend to reject. And as a side note, and it's quite important, this is only for communicated information. When it comes to perception, you tend to just change your priors. So if I really think that my friend Nikolai is in his office and I look in his office and he's not there, then I'm going to immediately change my mind. Whereas if someone tells me he's not in his office, maybe I won't accept that immediately. So fortunately, we are able sometimes to overcome this default reaction of just rejecting anything that doesn't fit with our priors. And to do that, we pay attention to a series of cues that might lead us to accept communicated information, even if it doesn't fit with our priors. So what are these cues? Well, this is not necessarily an exhaustive list, but these are I think the main ones. Is the source well informed? So for instance, has Joan personal experience with the phone that she's recommending? Is the source competent? Is Joan someone who knows a lot about smartphones in general? Does the source have our interests at heart? Is Joan a friend of ours, or is she a salesperson in an Apple store? Are many people agreeing? Like if all of your friends recommend a given phone, it's actually a pretty good cue that it might be a good phone. And are there good arguments? Is Joan able to tell you, look, you should buy this phone because of the amazing battery life, or the great camera, etc., etc. So there's quite a lot of evidence from adults showing that they are well able to take these cues into account and to be more likely to be influenced by someone who is well informed compared to poorly informed, etc., etc. What I will show you here is evidence that I think is in a way more striking from very small kids. And this one slide essentially summarizes about 20 years of research in the field of the development of trust in testimony, in which they have conducted now hundreds of experiments looking at the kind of cues small children or even infants and toddlers use to decide whom to trust and to decide whether they should change their minds. And so what the research has shown so far is that at least by the preschool years, the kids are able to take all of these cues into account. So they don't, so for instance, they're more likely to believe an informant who has proven competent in the past than an informant who has proven, incompetent in the past. Obviously, they don't do it as well as adults typically, and clearly it's a lifelong learning process to figure out, what are the best arguments and, exactly who has our interests at heart. But the basic mechanisms are in place very early. And in a way, the check marks that are not there don't mean necessarily that the kids can't do it at all. They just mean that it hasn't been shown yet. And so what I think happens is that when people have these cues, so when they can tell whether the source of the information they are evaluating is well informed, whether the source is competent, etc., when they have time to exchange arguments with the source, then people can revise their priors and change their minds and accept even kind of challenging information. But in the case of when these cues are not present, when you don't really know who the source is, you don't really know what their interests are, you can't really exchange arguments with them because you don't have time, because they're not actually there physically to talk to you. We tend to revert to a state of kind of rational skepticism. So we just, we go back to this state of just rejecting just about anything that doesn't fit with our priors, because we don't have good reasons to do otherwise. And I think this is what happens in the cases of mass persuasion, in the sense that, when you see an ad on TV, you don't know who is really giving you the information. You suspect that they don't have your best interest at heart. You clearly don't have time to exchange arguments with them. And so if the information that is given to you doesn't immediately kind of fit with your priors, it's really unlikely to influence you in any way. But that is true as a rule. And clearly, in spite of what I think are pretty well-functioning mechanisms to evaluate communicated information, people do accept a whole variety of false beliefs. So I'm not going to deny this kind of obvious truth. And so now I have to try to explain why we can have these pretty well-functioning cognitive mechanisms, and yet why some false beliefs can be quite culturally successful. So that's actually something that I can't really do now because it's a too large a question. So what I will do instead is focus on a narrower point, which is whether holding false beliefs, and in particular, whether holding false beliefs that have been transmitted through, not false beliefs that we formed ourselves, but false beliefs that have been given to us by others that have spread in the culture. How big of a deal is it? Like, how bad is it for people? How costly is it for them to hold these false beliefs? And is Voltaire right in a way when he said that believing absurdities could make us commit atrocities? And the argument I will make is that it is not the case. That fortunately, for the most part, people who hold kind of culturally spread false beliefs tend not to act on them, and that the costs for themselves, at least, tend to be pretty small. And to do that, I will use a distinction between intuitive and reflective beliefs that was laid out by Dan Sperber. And essentially, the idea is that intuitive beliefs are the beliefs you form through perception and through basic forms of testimony. So if you tell me what your name is, then I just believe that your name is that, and I will use that name in referring to you. I just believe that your name is X. Right now I see that there are some bamboos in front of me. I intuitively believe that there are bamboos in front of me, and I will, I'm not going to run into them. I will, I know what to do with them. By contrast, the idea here is that there is a whole other class of beliefs that are held reflectively that people genuinely profess. So they're not lying when they say that they believe in them, but these beliefs yet remain largely detached from other kind of cognitive or behavioral consequences. Essentially, people don't act on these reflective beliefs. And so the example I will give you is that of the Pizzagate conspiracy theory that was extremely widespread in the US during the 2016 presidential election between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And so according to that conspiracy theory that many of you might remember, high-level Democrats were abusing small children in the basement of a Comet ping pong pizzeria in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And indeed, if you look at polls at the time, they suggest that nearly half of Trump voters and even a small portion of Clinton voters believed that something like that conspiracy theory was true. And one of the reasons why that specific conspiracy theory became so famous and so infamous was this guy, Edgar Madison Welch, who took his truck and his gun, and he drove to DC, and he stormed the pizzeria, and he asked at gunpoint that the children be freed. He even fired a few shots into the door to what happened to be like a server room or something. And so plausibly, this guy had an intuitive belief that children were being abused, and his actions actually make sense in light of that belief. Like if you had, really kind of good evidence, if you had seen footage or, really had heard reliable testimony, that children were being abused somewhere, and you think there's no recourse because the cops are corrupt and everything, and it is within your power to actually do something about it, then you should. He was doing the right thing in many ways, given the beliefs that he had. At least he was coherent, he was consistent. There was something that made sense between his actions and his beliefs. By contrast, consider this guy who wrote a one-star review of the pizzeria, saying that the pizza was incredibly undercooked, that suspicious, professionally dressed men by the bar area that looked like regulars kept staring at my son and other kids in the place, definitely not coming back, beginning to think the conspiracies about this place are true. So that, by contrast, makes no sense. So that's what we would call having a reflective belief that the conspiracy is true, in the sense that there is no, in a way, there's no, kind of intuitive connection between believing that children are being abused and writing a review that, suggests that children are being abused, but still starts the review with the fact that the pizza is undercooked, which, clearly more important thing. And also, if you kind of suggest, you think that maybe kids are being raped somewhere and you're going to bring your own children there, seems a little bit bizarre. So there's just no logical connection between the actions and the belief. It's just a way of expressing the belief and not really to act on it. And so obviously the idea is that there was one guy who had an intuitive belief that children were being abused, whereas the vast majority of people, like 99.99% of the people who professed a belief in Pizzagate only held a reflective belief, which had no consequence for themselves or others really, except to kind of ruin the Google ratings of that poor pizzeria. And I think an interesting contrast in that respect is between people who claim to believe people who actually believe in conspiracy theories and who tend to be very vocal about them, even though that makes no sense. Like if you take like 9/11 truthers who claim that the CIA is so evil and powerful that they had 2 planes crash into the World Trade Center, they also believe that they can say that without being shot by the CIA, which is, just that wouldn't happen. And so, conspiracy theorists, they tend to not really act in line with their beliefs, except to talk about them, which is the one thing that doesn't make sense. And by contrast, if you look at people who have witnessed actual conspiracies, so typically, if you look at would-be whistleblowers, people who have seen in their administration or in their workplace things that are really shady, people shredding documents or whatever, they are really hard to get to talk. Like these people are really afraid, like the conspiracy theorists should be. It's really hard to get them to reveal what they know, and you see a completely different type of behavior, because they have an intuitive belief that the conspiracy is true, and indeed it is, whereas the people who hold conspiracy theories only have a reflective belief. Now, another really kind of nice example of this is the rumor that was circulating 8 years prior. I think it was in the Obama-McCain, maybe Obama-Romney, I don't remember. Actually, we'll see with them. Yeah, I think maybe it's the Obama-Romney campaign, when a lot of people came to believe that Obama was a Muslim, mostly Republicans, as you can imagine. And Kim and Kim have this lovely study in which they had like a panel data, so the same people being tracked over time. And as it so happens, the rumor kind of really took off in the middle of their study. And what they could show then is that people who really did not like Obama in the first place were kind of unsurprisingly much more likely to believe then that he was a Muslim. But then, even though for these people, presumably being a Muslim was a bad thing, this had no effect on their dislike of Obama. And so then again, it's more a way of justifying a pre-existing attitude, negative attitude towards Obama, rather than something that will cause the negative attitude in the first place. And so that's another kind of hallmark of many, but not all reflective beliefs, is that they are used, they don't cause bad behaviors, they just kind of justify them. And one of my really all-time favorite examples of that is that of bloodletting. So if you consider like the standard narrative, so bloodletting obviously is, more or less obviously, bloodletting is the practice of cutting up a part of your body. In the West, typically there is a forearm to let a bit of blood flow, so you feel better. And the standard narrative, the standard explanation for why people practice bloodletting was that they had read and they had accepted Galen's theory of the humor, according to which health depends on the balance between four humors. One of them is blood, and blood is the easiest one to act on. And so if you want to prevent disease or cure disease, a good thing to do is, in many, many cases, to engage in bloodletting. And actually for Galen, he even recommended bloodletting in cases of hemorrhage, which is pretty funny. And so, the story goes that people accepted these theories, and because they accepted this humoral theory of disease, they engaged in bloodletting. And a dramatic example of that was how George Washington, when he was taken ill with a throat infection in the winter of 1799, and the best doctors of the day were called to his bedside, and they bled him of 2.5 liters of blood, which is about half of someone's blood, and a pretty bad idea. And then, unsurprisingly, George Washington died. And so there it looks as if we have really a case in which people accept a false belief and on that basis engage in very costly behavior. Well, as it turns out, we looked at some data with some anthropological data with Elena Mitton and Nicolas Cladia. And everybody does bloodletting, like something like maybe a third at least of the world's culture practice bloodletting, even though none of them have ever heard of Galen or humors or Hippocratic writers or none of the ancient sources that the practice of bloodletting in the West was supposed to rely on, which means that all of these theories essentially play no causal role, or like a very small causal role, in the practice of bloodletting. Instead, what the data suggests is that the idea of drawing a bit of blood to cure an ailment is something that is extremely intuitive and kind of intuitively appealing to humans just across the world. And that if you happen to be in a very kind of cultured and sophisticated and literate society, you'd like to have your medical decisions, your therapies, with a strong theoretical backing. And so people like Galen and others were very happy to provide that theoretical backing. But these reflective beliefs, these theories, really had only a very small effect on the practice. So it's really like it's a practice that drives the beliefs instead of the other way around. And my last example is that of vaccination, which is pretty kind of sadly topical. I mean, even though by now just about most people are vaccinated anyway. This graph represents the rates of people who believe that vaccines are safe in green. They don't really know in blue, or they strongly disagree that vaccines are safe in red. Across many different countries, you can see there's the France's shameful exception, where it's kind of one of the most anti-vax countries in the world, with Japan, for some reason that I don't quite understand. And so what that graph shows is that everywhere in the world you have a few percent of the population that are really very strongly anti-vax, and then you have a decent share of the population who's kind of a bit in two minds about vaccines to some extent. And like again, a common narrative is that these anti-vax movements have been created, or at least greatly strengthened, by specific misbeliefs about vaccination, such as the idea that vaccination causes autism, or that vaccination is going to make you get 5G because of Bill Gates. But if we look at the kind of reasons people give to oppose vaccination across the world, we can see that they're very, very varied. So we have indeed the autism in the West, but there's stuff that will make you sterile in other countries. It causes shaken baby syndrome somehow. It really varies very, very widely, even though the basic phenomenon of people disliking vaccination is pretty universal. And so then again, what that suggests is that people, for a number of reasons, many people find vaccination a pretty kind of counterintuitive form of therapy. And then they come up with justifications, or they pick up justifications provided by others to defend that kind of unorthodox view. So to conclude, I have argued that we're indeed not gullible at all. On the contrary, we are endowed with efficient mechanisms of open vigilance. These mechanisms look at a number of cues. So the most important is actually, whether a piece of information, a piece of communicated information fits with your priors or not. But they also look at whether the sources were informed, if they're competent, et cetera, et cetera. For stuff that matters to us, and typically when we talk to people whom we know, things work really well. Like, we reject bad information, we accept good information. And that's what we see in our everyday lives most of the time. Like, it's really rare that we get kind of misled by people close to us in any dramatic manner. In the absence of these cues, when you don't really know who you're talking to, when you don't have time to exchange arguments with them, we have this state of kind of rational skepticism in which anything that doesn't fit with our priors tends to be rejected. And this is why mass persuasion, by and large, fails to persuade. Like, you can actually achieve other aims, but just the sheer goal of persuading is really just doesn't do it. Undoubtedly and undeniably, some false beliefs do spread in a culture, although actually it's really rare that they spread through mass persuasion. Typically, it's more kind of word of mouth type of phenomenon. But these beliefs tend to be reflective and to have relatively little impact on our thoughts and behaviors. And they actually also tend to serve some social functions, which help explain why. So the first, in a way, this helps explain why people they don't absolutely reject them, because it's fine to believe false things if it doesn't really cost you anything. And that actually positively helps explain why they would accept them, which is that it helps and it serves social purposes, such as justifying intuitive practices. Thank you.